Great, thank you very much. Okay, thank you. Thanks for the invitation to be here at the symposium. It's been a wonderful couple of days already. And at this symposium, we've been invited to reflect on uncertainties about the future and how these uncertainties are pervasive in our current moment, along with controversy and disagreement over desired ways of living, over who gets to define progress for the future, or even how to know the future. Especially given all the kind of unforeseen issues that face us in the coming decades. So how do we make sense of this moment that we're living in? So in this paper, I want to offer one way of doing so. It's situated, it's partial, it's very much a work in progress. It's designed to open up a conversation with all of you. It's going to use the collective pronoun in ways that some of you might find problematic. I know I do, but it's a kind of rhetorical thing. And I want to start with an often used, but also apparently misunderstood quotation from Antonio Gramsci's Prison Notebooks. So writing in 1930, he observed of the times in which he was living. The crisis consists precisely in the fact that the old is dying and the new cannot be born. In this interregnum, a great variety of morbid symptoms appear. Now, Akar, in his reading of this, challenges prevailing misreadings of this quote as being a reference to the forces of fascism, as being the morbid symptoms in question. He nevertheless says that the central idea in Gramsci's famous sentence belongs to the appraisal of any transitional phase during which an old order is dying, but a radically new one cannot yet be born. It seems to me, as it does to Akar, and I'm sure to you as well, this describes very well the situation of the moment. It's a sentiment that runs through various meditations on our current predicaments. First, as we are all fully aware, and we heard this in Kezia's talk yesterday, there is not one single moment of crisis in which we are living in or through. Instead, there is talk about being in a state of permacrisis, of a series of multiple intersecting crises that have appeared over several decades, each of their own spatial and temporal shapes, fast and slow disasters that bring death and destruction and foreclose possible futures. Further, with reference to the long-term environmental and climatic effects of capitalist societies and cultures, Roy Scranton, in Learning to Die in the Anthropocene, argues that the greatest challenge we face is a philosophical one, understanding that this civilization is already dead. If it is dead, then the future is too. Not literally, of course, but certain ideas of the future, at least, that have animated Euro-American civilization. Franco Berardi's book, After the Future, published in 2011, proclaims that the future is over and that people have all lost trust in the future. It no longer appears as a choice or a collective conscious action, but is a kind of unavoidable catastrophe that we cannot oppose in any way. There is then little sense that something new will be born that will offer a way to avoid the worst. So when it comes to understanding our present moment, as I see it, and as I kind of agonize over it from my small place in Northwest Europe at least, I find myself thinking, despite my otherwise secular outlook, in somewhat religious terms. Doesn't this interregnum that we are inhabiting feel more than just a period of discontinuity between the old dying order and a new order yet to come, whatever that will be? It seems to me that we are living in a purgatorial space, the outlines of which began to form more than 50 years ago and which are now being drawn in sharp relief around us. Now, I'm conscious that this is an imperfect metaphor. I'm not suggesting that we are being punished or that eventually we will reach paradise if we purge ourselves of our and our predecessors' sins against the future. We are also not simply climbing a mountain, as Dante imagined, making small progressive steps towards improvement to reach the summit and find salvation. But is there fire? Yes, there is fire on an increasingly heated planet. Is there torment? I'd say there's plenty of that going around. Is there repentance? Perhaps there is some of that, although many challenge whether any remorse is truly warranted. Is there hope? Yes, there is hope, as I will come on to discuss later. In short, the purgatory in which we, the denizens of a dead civilization, if we follow Scranton's argument, find ourselves in, is that which Jacques Le Goff calls an in-between position, living an anxious time, but also one tinged with hope. So this is the space alluded to in my title. On the one hand, we are living with, as Elisa Battistoni puts it, the wreckage of old futures, which consists in no small part of the harmful and unintended changes set in train by centuries of fossil fuel capitalism that extend far into the future. But on the other hand, we live with the hope that we can recognise and address the urgencies of now and engage in the difficult task, as Scranton puts it, of adapting with mortal humility to our new reality. And if we are looking for a great variety of morbid symptoms to appear, then as we dwell in this purgatorial state, which indicate a certain dis-ease with the present, then we need to look no further than at two not unrelated dimensions of contemporary futurity. These are futurelessness and retrofuturism. So this is what I like to sort of explore in a little bit more detail. So this notion of futurelessness, we can trace to the post-World War II period, to when the US and the USSR developed nuclear weapons that would ensure humanity's complete annihilation. Gunther Anders said that we were now living in the time of the end, which could at any moment become the end of time. And living in this time of the end, with the constant threat of extinction in a matter of minutes, I guess if you were lucky, Lewis Mumford ventured that this would mean that the belief in continuity, the sense of future that holds promise, disappears in society. The certainty of sudden obliteration cuts across every long-term plan. Every activity is more or less reduced to the time span of a single day on the assumption that this may be the last one. And when interviewing young people in the 1960s, psychologists appeared to substantiate many of Mumford's speculations. They found that the threat of nuclear war undermined their hopes for a future. As Martin Sand comments, we can consider those who have lost hope as not having a future, as they lack the firm conviction that their present desires will ever be fulfilled in the future. If this is so, then the lack of hope, whether this is felt in terms of individual or collective prospects, is significant, as it leaves desired futures appearing foreclosed. Now, in more contemporary times, a number of theorists and activists on the left contend that in European and other contexts, there is a prevailing feeling that the future has been and is being foreclosed. And so they argue, as I've alluded to already, that people no longer believe or trust in that imagined future with its origins in European cultures and politics of the 18th century. As Reinhard Koselleck relates, these ideas were centered on a philosophy of progress that emerged as a mixture of rational prediction and salvational expectation. And of course, this marks a shift from the kind of Christian expectation of the end of the world to the sense of the future as being open for the new and without limit, as Koselleck puts it. And this appeared to be justified by colonial expansion in the apparently limitless space of the New World, as well as scientific developments at home. So now Franco Berardi claims that people see the future as a disaster, not necessarily the sudden cataclysmic event of a nuclear attack, but the slow disaster of climate change, mass extinction, ecosystem degradation, and societal conflicts over dwindling resources. As Horvath puts it in Poetry from the Future, our world is no longer connected by a shared hope in a better future. On the contrary, it is hyper-connected by a prevailing feeling that there is no future at all. And when it comes to discussing sort of life in neoliberal economies and societies, Anne Allison and Charles Piot talk about how people may still dream of elsewhere and elsewhen, but they have stronger attachments to the present. These have intensified through rhythms of truncated work, interrupted life cycles, and the arrival of foreign migrants or military incursions, meaning that imaginings become radically present, focused on the present, or collapsed or imploded into the immediacy of survival. So Horvath claims that this feeling that there is no future is no longer confined to the global poor, but is also the anxious dinner table talk of a middle class that is losing ground across the globe. It is even extended to the global rich, who are investing in ever more elaborate means of escape from this unavoidable catastrophe. As Douglas Rushkoff's recently released book, Survival of the Richest, relates in quite some interesting, fascinating detail. So for the likes of many social theorists on the left then, such as Berardi, Battistoni, Horvath, Mark Fisher, it's the future alternative to neoliberalism that appears or feels foreclosed. So they say that today adherents to neoliberalism from a position of global hegemony have been able to declare that no other society is possible, although Andy has perhaps pointed us ways into beyond that. And imagined futures, they say, that offer an alternative to neoliberalism struggle to be performative, to win others over, because, as Fisher puts it, capitalism occupies the horizons of the thinkable. And this is a crucial point for Fisher in his work on capitalist realism, that contends with this kind of weary resignation that the prospects of a different kind of society in the future has disappeared. He contends that for most people under the age of 20 in Europe and North America, and he was writing this back in 2009, the lack of alternatives to capitalism is no longer even an issue. Eric Olin Wright observes that once both critics and defenders of capitalism believed that another world was possible, and there was a distinctive alternative way to organise economic and social life. But today, he asserts, most people in the world, especially in its economically developed regions, no longer believe in this possibility. Capitalism seems to be part of the natural order of things. So for the political left then, this sense of a once imagined future forms part of what Traverso calls left-wing melancholia. So for example, Berardi reflects on how the foreclosing of alternative futures produces a prevailing mood of impotence, hopelessness and depression among those who would wish for things to be otherwise. And even when discussing more recent movements that have emerged to oppose neoliberalism, such as the World Social Forum, Horvath seems very pessimistic that they will ever realise their promise that another world is possible. As well as those on the left, we can also look at the kind of genre of writing that the sociologist John Ory calls new catastrophism. So the kind of torrent of social science dystopic analysis that's been produced in the last sort of 15 years that concerns itself with the prospects of global catastrophes and the threat of human extinction. And we've obviously, talked about some of that already. And many of the contributors to this genre are concerned with the potential loss of European ideals and ways of life that they view as the peak of human development. And they fear a reversal to the kind of linear time that's been imagined in narratives of progress, and speculate on the possibility that humans might de-evolve or return to inferior ways of life, such as those of hunter-gatherers. So these kind of feelings of futurelessness, we can see articulated on the left, but also find themselves being sort of articulated also in other bodies of work that are focused around global catastrophes, civilizational and ecological collapse. So these different expressions of futurelessness, I would say, are kind of concern themselves with valued and desirable futures being foreclosed. And these are notable morbid symptoms of our times. They suggest that there might be no way out of our purgatory. We can't find that alternative. We can't believe in that alternative. Or there's only one way out, which is through kind of collapse or catastrophe. But alongside futurelessness, there is another turn in futurity that is also of note, and that is the phenomenon of retrofuturism. So in his treatment of postmodernism, Fredric Jameson drew attention to how it was characterised by pastiche and revivalism of past styles, which is extended also to past imaginaries of the future. So this is called retrofuturism, that trades in creating a nostalgia for what we once considered the future. In the context in which the future feels foreclosed for some and is imagined as a catastrophe, restoring past futures seems a significant cultural move by which we relive the future as our predecessors imagined it. So these past futures are spectres that haunt us today, as Mark Fisher puts it, futures that many expected, but which are unlikely ever to materialise. The nostalgia that many feel for them and the desire that they express to restore them to their rightful place ultimately expresses dissatisfaction and disappointment with the present in which they now live, and that it did not turn out as past generations expected. This nostalgia then for past futures is linked to futurelessness, which finds an audience when the future is otherwise viewed as more of the same, or at worst, a catastrophe. So it is here that I'd like to offer a reading of how the two most wealthy men in the world, Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos, offer us salvation by turning back to a future that some consigned to the past. Their retrofuturism involves another kind of space, outer space. So the development of human spaceflight has often been used as an index of technological progress, but more significantly, outer space itself has been a place to which humanity could escape its predicaments. It's been strongly utopian. So writing in 2006, the historian de Groot argued that supporters of human spaceflight always thought that exploration was the destiny of man, as he puts it. They thought it was the future, but they were wrong. And yet today, influential and controversial figures such as Musk and Bezos have become prominent spokespeople for human expansion in the solar system, both to usher in a better future and to safeguard against future risks and harm, as we heard yesterday in Jessica's talk. For Musk and his company SpaceX, with its corporate mission to making life multiplanetary, the vision is to establish a city on Mars. And here's a view of what it could look like. In this, he continues in a long tradition in which Mars has been the screen on which we have projected our hopes for the future and our fears of ecological devastation on Earth. Science fiction authors, for example, have imagined Mars as a utopian place, somewhere to establish a better way of living and being, to quote Ruth Levitas. And in media interviews, Musk refers to the spirit of human, or more specifically American, exploration. He states that establishing a self-sustaining base on Mars would be the most exciting adventure I could imagine for humanity. That's the kind of future I want us to have, and I think a lot of people want us to have, particularly Americans. And this is coupled with a sense of disappointment that previous promises about human adventure in outer space have not been fulfilled. So Musk contends that a lot of people feel more than a little disappointed that the high watermark of human exploration was 1969. The dream of human space travel died for a lot of people. SpaceX is about restoring that dream. So Musk's statement is typical of the way that supporters of human spaceflight recall the Apollo space program with a potent mix of excitement and disappointment, remembering the moon landing as a pivotal moment of achievement, but also the point at which their preferred vision of the future was in effect cancelled. So then Musk argues that his company will reset humanity back in a desirable direction. But while articulating this narrative of progress, Musk also presents his vision for humans becoming a multiplanetary species would serve as a hedge against the growing and myriad threats to our survival. So these are existential threats imagined in the form of natural disasters, as well as human-made ones, such as bioengineered viruses or AI. So Musk claims that there's a strong possibility of another dark age, especially if there's a worldwide conflict, and justifies dedicating resources to building this city on Mars to make sure that there's enough of a seed of human civilization somewhere to bring it back. And here he's very influenced by his reading of Isaac Asimov's Foundation series, in which the author tells the story of the fall of a galactic empire that ushers in a dark age. So Musk observes in an interview for Rolling Stone that it's a kind of futuristic version of Gibbon's Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire. Let's say you were at the peak of the Roman Empire. What would you do? What action could you take to minimize decline? And so Musk sees a kind of parallel for our time here. Now, alongside Musk, Jeff Bezos also gives us a salvatory vision of the future. His plan is to save us from running out of energy. Energy use, Bezos explains in a public talk he gave called Going to Space to Benefit Earth, is increasing, and energy use is essential to growth and to living in a dynamic society. And Bezos suggests that we get to choose the kind of future we want. We can either have stasis and rationing, or we can have dynamism and growth. And he offers up a vision of an incredible civilization of 1 trillion human beings living and thriving in the solar system, or far fewer, sharing out the finite resources of Earth. And as with Musk, Bezos draws on the kind of collective remembrance of the Apollo program and takes inspiration from Gerard O'Neill, the American physicist whose book The High Frontier came out in 1977. And in this, he advocated humans expanding into the solar system and conscious of the ecological impact of humans in the global north. O'Neill argued that establishing new human places to live in outer space would solve the then pressing energy crisis and provide opportunity for increased human options and development. So these are exactly the same arguments that Bezos is recycling today. He imagines that there are infinite resources to be found in the solar system, and that those resources would support a human civilization of 1 trillion humans, which would mean, he says, that we would have 1,000 Mozarts and 1,000 Einsteins. This would be an incredible civilization. So taken together, both Musk and Bezos seek to persuade others that salvation from catastrophe, or at best a society in which humans ration out dwindling resources, is to be found by venturing out into the spaces of outer space. That is the best future humans could live. That's where it's to be found. So their visions represent forms of escape. And of course, there's little that is new in this. As Robert Romanshine remarks, the dream of spaceflight is the escape from death of a planet that humans have hardwired for destruction. Escaping Earth, escaping the fate of death, was a dream of cosmism as well in the early 20th century, which expressed a commitment to pursuing immortality through life in the cosmos. And some of the links between cosmism and Silicon Valley kind of libertarianism is really interesting to kind of explore in more detail. Now, of course, these kinds of salvatory visions, this is the sort of Gerard O'Neill kind of colony sort of simulation that accompanied Bezos's talk, have been roundly criticised, of course, from a number of quarters. For one, Bruno Latour is dismissive of anyone investing hopes or money in outer space. In Facing Gaia, 8 lectures on the new climatic regime that he delivered in 2012, Latour offers up the notion of Earth-boundedness, which might be taken as a kind of counterpoint or a counter-concept to being multi-planetary. So he says that while billions might be spent to send a few individuals to dead planets, Earth remains the only live one. And he concludes that where things will happen will be down here and now. Don't dream anymore. You won't escape to outer space. You have no other abode than down here, the shrinking planet. For Latour, the Anthropocene demands that we give up dreams of outer space and appreciate that we are Earth-bound, both in the sense that there is no escape route except back on Earth, and that the answers to our problems lie here on Earth, and that we cannot simply exit to another world. We are, as Latour says, imprisoned in Earth's tiny local atmosphere. So far I have sketched what I see as 2 distinct but interlinked morbid symptoms of the crises we face. A sense of futurelessness, found not only by the left but by others too. A sense that the futures that we have come to expect, actors feel are being foreclosed. and the retrofuturism of mid-20th century visions of human space exploration that promise to save us from catastrophe and open up a limitless future. But maybe these morbid symptoms are only the outward manifestations of a much deeper malaise with our very relationship to the future itself. We talked about Haraway yesterday, staying with the trouble. She sort of says, in order to stay with the trouble, we need to be truly present. And she's concerned that, thinking in terms of the future in order to sort of, intervene into our present moment is kind of deeply problematic. So she's kind of rejecting the future, or thinking about the future as the kind of the appropriate way kind of forward. And I guess we've come to appreciate that whatever we do now to reshape what comes next is always going to be difficult and dangerous and tricky. There is, as Haraway puts it, always a problematic and potent tie between desires and dreams and the material outcomes and consequences of our actions. As Barbara Adam and Chris Groves remind us, our actions are continually setting in train what they call latent futures that will one day materialise, and we don't fully know what those futures will be. And we might act with the best of intentions, but our best intentions can produce unintended consequences, as we know. Unforeseen effects and unanticipated events can stall, complicate, or end prematurely our visions of the future. And moreover, the timescale over which futures unfold adds a further complication, because what might appear to be relatively benign over 50 years or 100 years might become far more pernicious over a much longer time. As Wendell Bell observes, there are few, if any, final solutions. Rather, there are corrections, and then there are new designs and more corrections. Now, all this might reinforce a sort of sense of inaction, but perhaps it can also direct us to be humble, to avoid the hubris of grand visions of the future that promise to sweep aside problems of the present. The stories of futures that we need to hear now, I would venture, are those that begin with the urgencies of now, as best as we can grasp what the now is, seeing it both as the outcome of past actions and our ongoing remaking of the world. These stories would need to help humans to engage in that difficult task, as Scranton puts it, of adapting with mortal humility to our new reality. And Scranton argues that humanity, or perhaps more precisely the humans who live in that civilization, Euro-American civilization that he's referring to, are going to need new myths and new stories and new conceptual understandings of reality and the new relationship to the deep polyglot traditions of human culture that carbon-based capitalism has vitiated through commodification and assimilation. As Martin Savansky cautions, the end of the world is always the end of some world in this world. The end of this world, the Euro-American extractive mode of living through which civilization developed, is not the end of everything as such. Recognizing this reveals that the choice is not between salvation and damnation, life or death, but one between divergent modes of living and dying, of composing worlds, of inhabiting the earth, he argues. Moreover, and we alluded to this yesterday in discussions, many European and North American writers focus on future catastrophes that could bring about civilizational collapse. And Mitchell and Chowdhury remind us that for many Black, Indigenous, and peoples of colour, the catastrophe is not in the future, but it has already unfolded over the past 5 centuries. They relate how BIPOC futurisms approach ecological crises as sources of open-ended renewal and regeneration rather than as decline and extinction. And Mitchell and Chowdhury argue that BIPOC thinkers, makers and actors are already and have long been generating new worlds in the wake of the apocalypse of white domination. So Dante imagined that purgatory is also the space of hope. And hope comes from recognizing that the new is indeed being born every day, often in unspectacular ways, through the actions of so many different people. And here I find Les Back's discussion about the imperative of worldly hope instructive. So he argues that hope is better conceived as a worldly attentiveness to what is emerging in the conditions of the present as they are carried into the future. Hope then involves not only daydreaming in the possible, and the not yet decided conclusion, but also taking in the world as it is. So taking his inspiration from Terry Eagleton, Bach argues that hope should be anchored in the present and attentive to what is unfolding at any given moment. We must not get too far ahead of ourselves. I would venture then that we can place the future that we can imagine and hope for, not far away in the imagined spaces of outer space, but grounded in the places and practices of worldly hope. And where might we find those examples of worldly hope? Not in the pronouncements and spacecraft designs of Musk and Bezos, but in the other places where the difficulties of day-to-day living are negotiated and overcome. There are lots of examples that I could give, but I've run out of time. So I just want to finish with just one example of worldly hope. And this goes back to a story that caught my eye at the beginning of the COVID lockdown in April 2020. And it was a lovely story about a group of people in an area of Glasgow in Scotland who take part in what's called magnet fishing in their local canal. So they throw the magnets into the water. They find items that have been discarded, shopping trolleys mostly, but also guns, and even once a cannonball dating from the 16th century. And interviewed by The Guardian's journalist, people talked about how this fostered new friendships and stronger social connections. And one, this is Joy Miller pictured here, who talked about her severe anxiety, depression, and panic attacks. And she said that this was an opportunity to do something positive for the planet her grandkids will inherit. I love it. It's so therapeutic, she says. It does wonders for me. I get therapy knowing I'm cleaning the environment. We used to have great fishing in Scotland on the canals. It's not like that now because of the shopping trolleys, bikes and scooters. So this one simple story, the sense of place and belonging that it emphasizes, the sense of doing something that helps the better present lives and promises better futures, strikes me as a powerful expression of worldly hope in action to hold on to in these purgatorial times in which we find ourselves. And on that note, I shall finish since I have now run out of time. Thank you.